I'm Isabella, 32 years old, and the day my father died was the day my entire world unraveled. After years of sacrifice managing his company, caring for him through illness, putting my own life on hold, I thought I would finally be recognized, finally be treated as the daughter who never left his side. I believed my father's promise. I believed blood was thicker than water. I believed my family would protect me. But on the day of the will reading, I was handed a check for exactly $0. Every cent, all $12 million, was given to my spoiled younger brother. The same brother who never worked a day in his life, who spent his days drinking champagne and making reckless decisions. They thought I would stay quiet. They thought I would walk away in shame. But I didn't. I stood up. And I chose his $500,000 wedding day to take everything back. I grew up in a house that many people would have called a dream. A grand stone mansion with endless corridors, towering windows, and a garden so manicured it looked like it had been lifted out of a fairy tale. But the thing about houses like that is they're often cold. They echo too much. They hold silence too well. Ours was no exception. On the surface, we were the picture of privilege. My father, William, was a respected businessman with a reputation for integrity. My mother, Eleanor, was elegant and poised, always draped in pearls and perfectly tailored silk. And then there was my little brother, Andrew, the golden boy. I was the firstborn, 3 years older, quiet and observant. People always said I had my father's eyes, the kind that saw through. But inside those beautiful walls, the air was different. My father was strict but fair. He believed in hard work, in earning what you have. He taught me the value of responsibility early on. When I brought home good grades or took care of something without being asked, he would rest his hand on my shoulder and simply say, "Good." It wasn't, "My mother didn't." She was polite to me, yes, but distant. To her daughters were expected to be composed, quiet, and useful. Sons were meant to be adored, spoiled, and praised for simply existing. When Andrew was born, I still remember my 6th birthday. I unwrapped a modest box, a set of classic novels. I loved books, so I smiled, truly grateful. Then Andrew, barely 3, toddled in and was handed a shiny miniature car worth more than most people's monthly salary. My mother laughed softly and said, "Well, he's a boy. He needs something exciting." That was the first time I felt it, that sharp sting of being less. As we grew, the divide deepened. Christmas mornings were always the same story. Andrew would wake up to the latest gadgets, designer clothes, and trips planned just for him. I would get something practical, a new coat, a journal, sometimes nothing more than a polite thank you for helping me prepare the holidays from my mother. It was made clear to me early on, Andrew's needs come first. When he wanted something, it was mine to give up, my time, my toys, my space. When he wanted the bigger room, I moved without protest. When he didn't feel like doing chores, I picked up the slack. My mother always reminded me gently, "You're the older sister. You have to set an example. You have to take care of your little brother." Andrew grew up with no real sense of consequence. He was coddled, praised for mediocrity, and celebrated for things he didn't earn. By the time we were teenagers, he was charming and reckless, used to getting whatever he wanted. He'd come home late from parties reeking of alcohol, and my mother would simply smile, saying, "He's young, let him have his fun." Meanwhile, if I stayed out even half an hour past curfew, because I was at the library no less, I'd be met with sharp questions and raised eyebrows. My father, though he never played that game. He didn't indulge Andrew the way my mother did. I think he saw the entitlement growing in him like a weed he couldn't pull fast enough. One night when Andrew was 16, my father caught him lying about crashing one of the family cars. The look on my father's face was more disappointment than anger. After Andrew stormed off, he turned to me and muttered, "Entitlement is a disease, Isabella. Don't ever let it take root in you." While Andrew partied his way through college, an expensive private university fully funded by our father, I stayed home and learned the business. My father started taking me into the office when I was 18. I sat quietly in meetings, taking notes, learning how deals were made. I handled tedious tasks no one else wanted, making sure things ran smoothly in the background. It wasn't glamorous, but it made me feel like I had a purpose. And secretly, I hoped my efforts would be recognized. Andrew, of course, had no interest in any of it. He was too busy living the life of someone who believed money would always be there for him. New cars, new girlfriends, endless trips abroad. When he graduated, he didn't apply for a job. My father bought him a penthouse downtown as a gift. When I graduated, I got a pat on the back and a reminder from my mother that you should feel proud to serve the family. By the time I was in my late 20s, the contrast between us was glaring. I was working full-time in the family company, unpaid, holding everything together. Andrew was still finding himself, which meant hosting parties and posting pictures from luxury resorts. And my mother, ever the enabler, defended him at every turn. Then came my father's illness. It started with fatigue. He'd get winded climbing the stairs. Then came the hospital visits, the treatments, the long nights. And I was there. Always there. I managed his care, stayed up late reading medical reports, and made sure the staff followed every instruction. I cooked for him, sat by his bedside when he couldn't sleep, held his hand when the pain became too much. And Andrew, he vanished. He was always too busy with his girlfriend or important trips abroad. I saw him maybe twice the entire time my father was sick. He'd show up briefly, all cologne and charm, kiss my mother on the cheek, and leave before my father even woke up. I will never forget one quiet evening. The house was dimly lit, and the only sound was the soft hum of the machines keeping my father stable. He reached for my hand, his grip weak, but his eyes steady. "Isabella," he whispered, his voice rough but clear. "I know how much you've given up. I know you've carried more than your share. Don't worry. When I'm gone, everything will be fair. You will be protected." I believed him. I believed every word. But while I was sitting there by his side, while I was pouring everything I had into keeping him comfortable, something else was happening in the shadows. My mother and Andrew were making their moves. Looking back now, I see the signs. The family lawyer who used to call me with updates suddenly stopped answering my messages. My mother started making quiet trips into the city with Andrew. When I asked, she'd smile too sweetly and say, "Oh, nothing for you to worry about, darling. Just paperwork." Even the staff seemed uneasy around me. They'd stop talking when I entered the room, their eyes flicking away too quickly. It was like the house itself was holding its breath. When my father finally passed, the world went still. I stood by his bed numb while my mother dabbed her dry eyes with a silk handkerchief. Andrew arrived late, sunglasses still on indoors, his presence smelling more of expensive cologne than grief. I was too heartbroken to notice anything strange then. Too consumed by the loss. But a week later, I heard it. I was walking past the study when I caught my mother's voice, low but sharp. "It's settled then." "Good. She won't see a penny. It's all going to Andrew just as it should." I froze. Then came Andrew's laugh, smug and cruel. "She's been working for free all these years. Might as well keep it that way." My hands shook. My heart pounded so loud I thought they'd hear it. I wanted to burst in demand, answers, scream at them for daring to betray me like this. But some cold, calculating instinct held me back. "Wait. Watch." From that moment on, I knew something was wrong. I tried to reach the family lawyer, but his secretary kept making excuses. When I confronted my mother, she smiled, her voice syrupy and calm. "Oh, Isabella, you're overthinking. Everything will be fine." But her eyes gave her away. I knew. I didn't know how far they would go, but I knew. What I didn't realize then was that they weren't just planning to cut me out quietly. They wanted to humiliate me. They wanted to make me small. And I had no idea just how bad it was about to get. ChatGPT'd and I was always the one who carried the weight. While Andrew drifted from one luxury to the next, I was the one who stayed grounded. I studied economics because my father said it would be useful for the family business, and though it wasn't my passion, I excelled. I learned every corner of the company, from the accounts to the supply chains, from the boardroom negotiations to the hidden debts no one else wanted to face. When the company hit a quiet financial crisis, a bad investment that nearly sank one of our key subsidiaries, I was the one who caught it before it spiraled. I worked nights, combing through ledgers, restructuring budgets, negotiating with creditors behind closed doors. No one saw it happen. No one thanked me. The headlines never mentioned the quiet daughter who'd saved the family name. But my father knew. He was proud even if he didn't say it in so many words. Andrew. He was nowhere near the office. He showed up only when there was a gala or a family photo opportunity. He liked to call himself a shareholder, a future CEO, but he never worked a day in his life. He'd stroll into the company once every few months in tailored suits, shake a few hands, and disappear by lunchtime. My mother acted as if this was normal, even expected. She'd pat his arm and say, "You'll take over when the time is right, darling. Just enjoy your youth for now." And me? I was treated like the background character. My contributions were invisible. My mother never once said thank you. When I saved the company from that crisis, she told the family over dinner, "We're lucky Andrew will be the one to lead one day. He has such presence." Isabella, well, she's good with the numbers. I should have been angry, but at the time, I swallowed it. I told myself that the work mattered more than the recognition. I believed my father's words when he told me that in the end, everything would be fair. I sacrificed more than just time for this family. When my friends were getting married, starting their own lives, I stayed behind. I turned down a promising job offer overseas because my father asked me to remain close. I never dated seriously. Who would want someone who was always on call, always responsible for a sick father, a crumbling business, a brother who couldn't be bothered? When my father's illness worsened, the burden doubled. I was at the hospital every day. I coordinated with the doctors, researched treatments, even paid for additional care out of my own savings when my mother complained about the costs. And Andrew. He didn't even show up for my father's final treatments. He sent one bouquet of overpriced flowers with a lazy note that read, "Get well soon, Dad, Andrew." And then he vanished again off to Monaco with his girlfriend for what he called a mental break. My mother didn't say a word about it. She was too busy obsessing over the details of Andrew's upcoming wedding. She would spend hours on the phone discussing flower arrangements, menus, venues, all while my father was slipping away in the room next door. It broke something in me to watch that. To watch her plan a $500,000 wedding, while the man who had built everything was lying frail and weak, fading more each day. But even then, I held on. I believed that all my sacrifices, the sleepless nights, the abandoned dreams, the lonely years, would mean something. And for a brief moment, I thought they did. It was 2 weeks before he passed. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels heavy. I was sitting beside his bed, reading a report he'd asked me to review when he opened his eyes and looked at me with a clarity I hadn't seen in weeks. "Isabella," he said softly, his voice hoarse but steady, "I know how much you've given up. I know Andrew is not what he should be. But you've done everything I could have ever asked. Everything will belong to you. You deserve it. Don't doubt it." My heart eased for the first time in years. I remember squeezing his hand, whispering through tears, "Thank you, Dad. I promise I'll take care of everything. I'll protect what you built." In that moment, I believed the future was secure. I believed he'd made arrangements. I believed I wouldn't be left standing alone. And for a brief while, that belief kept me going. After he passed, I threw myself into making sure everything was handled. I organized the funeral, managed the guests, and dealt with the mountain of paperwork that comes with death. My mother contributed nothing except complaints about the casket not being grand enough for his legacy. Andrew showed up only for the funeral itself, making a dramatic entrance late, dressed like a movie star, with his fiancée clinging to his arm. Even in grief, I stayed composed. I thought, "Just a little longer, Isabella. When the will is read, you'll finally have the security he promised you. You'll finally know it was all worth it." But as the days passed, I started to notice strange things. The family lawyer, someone who had always been responsible, stopped returning my calls. My mother began locking her study door, whispering on the phone late at night. Andrew was suddenly far more involved in the family matters than he'd ever been before. I asked her once casually why the will reading was taking so long. She gave me that smile. That thin, sharp smile I'd seen 1,000 times. "These things take time, darling. Don't be impatient." But the unease gnawed at me. I even overheard snippets of conversation between Andrew and my mother. Once, as I passed by the sitting room, I caught Andrew saying, "Are you sure she won't find out?" And my mother's voice calm and cold. "She won't. She's too busy playing the dutiful daughter to notice what's right in front of her." I felt like I was drowning in a sea of half-truths and shadows. Something was wrong. Still, I tried to focus on the good, on the promise my father had made, on the belief that he wouldn't have left me unprotected. But hope can be cruel when it's all you have. The day of the will reading was supposed to be the day everything made sense. It was supposed to be the moment I could breathe, the moment I could finally step into the role I had earned. I remember waking up that morning feeling a mix of sadness and resolve. I wore a simple black dress, tied my hair back neatly. I wanted to look strong, compose someone worthy of carrying on my father's legacy. I walked into the lawyer's office expecting closure, expecting justice. I didn't know I was walking into a betrayal so deep it would shatter every illusion I'd ever held about family. After the funeral, the house felt unnervingly quiet, but it wasn't the kind of quiet born from grief. It was something else, something calculated. My mother didn't shed a tear after the day of the burial. She hosted guests in the drawing room with a glass of champagne in hand, thanking them for their condolences like she was greeting guests at a gala. Andrew, of course, played the part of the grieving son for exactly one day, then vanished back into his usual routine lunches at exclusive clubs, shopping trips for his fiancée, and late-night parties. I was the only one still in mourning. I could still feel my father's absence in every corner of that house. His study, once filled with the faint smell of tobacco and leather-bound books, now seemed hollow. And yet my mother and brother carried on as if nothing had happened. At first I told myself it was just their way of coping. Not everyone grieves the same, right? But the longer it went on, the clearer it became. They weren't grieving at all. They were relieved. The will reading was supposed to happen within 2 weeks of his passing. That's what my father had arranged, or so I thought. But days turned into weeks, and every time I asked the family lawyer, he had a new excuse. "There are some documents that need final verification. Your mother requested a delay to ensure all assets are properly accounted for. It's just a matter of timing, nothing to worry about." It didn't sit right with me. This was a man who had always been meticulous, prompt, and precise. Now he was vague, almost evasive. I started noticing other things too. My mother would leave the house at odd hours, always with Andrew. They'd return late at night, exchanging quick, secretive glances. When I asked where they'd been, my mother would smile that polished smile and say, "Just meetings, darling. Business you wouldn't understand." But the most chilling moment came when I heard them talking. It was late evening, and I was walking past my mother's private study when I heard her voice through the slightly ajar door. Her tone was sharp, purposeful, with none of the sweetness she usually used around me. "Konyen tum moi tu da sung, kota se kong kamot su." Even though it was in Vietnamese, I knew exactly what it meant. "Don't worry, it's all done. She won't get a single penny." There was a pause then, Andrew's laugh, low, smug, unbothered. I froze. My fingers gripped the edge of the wall so tightly my knuckles turned white. My heart pounded in my ears. I leaned closer, barely breathing, but their voices dropped into a whisper after that. For a long moment I just stood there in the dim hallway, my mind racing. Were they talking about me, about the inheritance, about the promise my father had made to me on his deathbed? I didn't barge in. I didn't want them to know I'd heard. Instead, I turned quietly and walked away, every step heavier than the last. The next morning I tried to act normal, but something in my expression must have shifted because one of the house staff, an older woman who had been with our family for decades, approached me hesitantly. "Miss Isabella," she said in a low voice while helping me in the kitchen. "Be careful. Not everything is as it seems. Some arrangements have been made. Things you may not know about." Her eyes were full of pity. She glanced around nervously before excusing herself and walking away. That was all she said. But it was enough to confirm what I already felt deep in my bones. Something was wrong. I decided to confront my mother. We were sitting in the solarium, the afternoon light streaming through the glass windows. I put my teacup down deliberately and looked at her. "Why hasn't the will been read yet?" I asked. She didn't even blink. "These things take time, Isabella." Time. Dad was very clear about wanting it handled quickly. She smiled, soft, dismissive. "You're overthinking. Everything is in order. It's all by the law." There was a coolness in her tone, a finality that made it impossible to push further. Later that night, I received a text from Andrew. "Don't expect much. You were never Dad's favorite, and you were definitely never Mom's. Just don't embarrass yourself." I stared at the screen, my hands trembling. I wanted to reply, wanted to scream at him for being so vile, but something inside me went still. I didn't reply. I didn't storm into my mother's room. I just waited, because despite everything, despite the whispers and the texts and the evasive lawyer, I still clung to the one thing that kept me sane, my father's promise. Everything will belong to you. You deserve it. I wanted to believe he had secured everything, that no matter what my mother and Andrew were plotting, the truth would come out in the reading of the will. So I kept quiet. I told myself patience was better than panic. But deep down, I could feel it, the tension was building. The house felt heavier with each passing day, like it was holding its breath before an inevitable storm. The day of the will reading was finally set. I remember the date vividly. My mother and Andrew seemed unusually relaxed, almost too calm. My mother even had the nerve to tell me, "Wear something nice, Isabella. This is an important day for the family." I stared at her, searching her face for any trace of honesty. But all I saw was a mask. As I got ready that morning, I had the strangest feeling. It was the feeling you get when you're about to step off a cliff you didn't know was there. Like you're teetering on the edge of something that's about to change your life forever. I tried to silence the voice in my head telling me this was going to end badly, but it didn't matter, because deep down I already knew. Something was coming. Something I couldn't yet see, but could feel in the pit of my stomach. And when it came, it would destroy everything I thought I knew about my family. The morning of the will reading felt heavy, like the air itself knew what was coming. I woke before sunrise, staring at the ceiling, replaying my father's last words in my mind. "Everything will belong to you. You deserve it." That promise was the only thing keeping me steady. I chose a simple black dress, modest but sharp. I wanted to look composed, strong, like someone who could carry on his legacy. When I walked downstairs, my mother and Andrew were already waiting. My mother was dressed in a tailored cream suit, pearls gleaming against her neck, her expression calm, too calm. Andrew sat there smirking in an Italian designer suit, his fiancée glued to his arm like an accessory. He glanced at me with a sly smile, one that said more than words ever could. We arrived at the lawyer's office together. It was a cold, sterile room with leather chairs and an old wooden table polished to a shine. The lawyer, Mr. Grayson, stood by the window, his face unreadable as he shuffled through a thick stack of documents. "Thank you for coming," he said curtly, motioning for you. I took a deep breath and settled into the chair. My fingers gripped the armrest so tightly my knuckles turned pale. Andrew lounged back in his seat like this was all a formality, while my mother folded her hands neatly in her lap, her eyes fixed on the lawyer with a faint, almost expectant smile. Mr. Grayson began. He spoke of my father's accomplishments, his assets, his businesses. He detailed the properties, our mansion, the penthouses, the vacation homes abroad, the investments, the company shares, and then he started reading the actual allocation. "To my beloved son Andrew." He paused, adjusting his glasses. "I bequeath the entirety of my estate, including all real estate holdings, company shares, and financial assets totaling approximately $12 million. My heart stopped. I froze in my chair, unsure if I'd heard correctly. Andrew beamed. My mother's lips curved into a small, satisfied smile. I waited for my name. I waited for the part where it would say, "The rest would go to me, the daughter who never left the one who had stood by his side when no one else did." But it didn't come. Instead, the lawyer continued, his tone flat, almost mechanical. And as per the addendum filed 3 weeks before Mr. Williams' passing, his daughter Isabella has declined any inheritance and has requested to be removed from all claims to the estate. I blinked, my breath catching in my throat. What? He cleared his throat, shuffling another paper. There is also a signed statement here, Isabella's formal renunciation of any financial or property claims. Her words, quote, "I wish for all assets to go to my brother. I do not want to be burdened with the responsibility." No. My voice was barely a whisper. That's not true. I never. Before I could finish, he slid a document across the table. My name was there. My signature. Except it wasn't. It was close, but I could see it wasn't mine. The loops in the letters were wrong. The pressure of the pen strokes was uneven. I stared at it numb as a cold realization washed over me. They forged it. They forged my name. I turned my gaze to my mother. She didn't look surprised. In fact, she didn't even bother pretending. "I didn't sign this," I said, my voice trembling but rising. "This is fake." Mr. Grayson shifted uncomfortably. I have this on file as legitimate Isabella. It was submitted directly to me by your mother. I had no reason to believe otherwise." I turned back to her, my hands shaking. How could you do this?" She tilted her head slightly, her voice calm and almost amused. "Your father was weak at the end, confused. He would have made the wrong decisions. I simply adjusted things, made them more reasonable." "Reasonable?" My voice cracked. "Yes," she said, her tone sharper now. "You're a woman. You'll marry one day if anyone will have you. What use do you have for $12 million? It belongs with the son of the family. That's how it's always been." I couldn't breathe. Andrew laughed softly, leaning back in his chair like a king on his throne. "Come on, Isabella. Don't act so shocked. You were always just there. Good for errands. Good for keeping Dad happy. But let's be real, you were never the favorite." I felt the room spinning. Dad promised me." Andrew smirked. "Dad isn't here anymore. And frankly, you should be thanking us. We're letting you keep your dignity. Think of this as freedom. You don't have to carry this family anymore." I stared at them, unable to process the words coming out of their mouths. My mother's voice cut through the haze, sharp and cruel. "Stop being dramatic. You have nothing to complain about. You'll land on your feet. Women like you always do. But money that stays with the bloodline, with the son, that's how it works." Every word was like a knife twisting deeper. I felt something inside me shatter. The lawyer said something about formalities, about needing my acknowledgement, that the reading was complete. But I barely heard him. My ears were ringing, my body numb. I was staring down at the forged paper in front of me, my fake signature staring back like a slap in the face. They had taken everything. Not just the money, not just the houses, not just the company I had worked tirelessly to save. They had taken my father's promise and turned it into a lie. I tried to stand, but my legs felt like they were made of lead. I gripped the edge of the table to steady myself. Andrew's voice followed me like a shadow. "Don't make a scene, Isabella. You're embarrassing yourself." I turned slowly, meeting his gaze. His grin was cruel, mocking. For a brief moment, I thought I might faint. The room felt smaller, like the walls were closing in. My vision blurred at the edges, my breath shallow. But then something shifted. A strange calm settled over me. I straightened my back. My face went cold, expressionless. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I just looked at them. Looked at my mother's smug smile. Looked at Andrew's arrogant posture. And I let the silence stretch long enough for it to become uncomfortable. Then I turned and walked out. No words, no fight. I left the lawyer's office, each step heavier than the last, but my head held high. They thought I was defeated. They thought that by taking everything from me, they had won. But as I walked out into the bright, bitter sunlight, I knew one thing for certain. This wasn't the end. This was the beginning. I didn't cry the day they stole everything from me. I couldn't. My grief had hardened into something colder, sharper. I left that lawyer's office without a word, but inside I was already shifting. I wouldn't let them see me break. I went home that night to a house that no longer felt like mine. Every corner of it whispered betrayal. My father's study still smelled faintly of him tobacco, old paper leather, but it felt tainted now, like even his memory had been stolen from me. My mother and Andrew were already celebrating, laughing together in the dining room over champagne. They didn't even lower their voices. I walked past them in silence, climbed the stairs, and closed my door. And for the first time in my life, I felt completely alone. But I wasn't as helpless as they thought. The next morning, I called the only person I knew I could trust, Maya. She wasn't just my closest friend. She was also a brilliant attorney who had worked on high-profile inheritance cases before. I met her in a quiet cafe, my hands still trembling as I handed over the forged documents. "They forged my signature," I said quietly. My voice was steady, but my chest burned with restrained rage. Maya examined the paper carefully, her brow furrowing. "It's sloppy," she muttered. "Not bad enough to be obvious, but not good enough to hold up under scrutiny. And if they submitted this to the lawyer, there has to be a paper trail." She leaned back in her chair and looked at me. "Do you want to fight this?" I met her gaze without hesitation. "I want the truth. I want everything my father promised me. And I want them to regret thinking I wouldn't fight back." So we began. Quietly, methodically. Maya filed a discreet request for access to my father's original documents. She pulled property records, business filings, and anything that would show inconsistencies. Meanwhile, I started combing through my father's office late at night, looking for anything he might have left hidden. That's when I found it. Tucked inside one of his ledgers was a handwritten note in his familiar, precise handwriting. "Final will be drafted in February. Assets are divided fairly. Isabella, primary beneficiary." I sat there holding that scrap of paper, my heart pounding. He had done it. He had made sure I was protected. So how had it all changed in the last weeks of his life? The answer was obvious. My mother, Andrew. The more Maya dug, the more the puzzle came together. The family lawyer had received an amended will only 3 weeks before my father's death, right when he was weakest, barely conscious most days. Witnesses said my mother and Andrew were the only ones present when the papers were signed. The lawyer claimed he saw my father sign, but the signature on that amendment was suspiciously shaky compared to his usual one. Worse, we discovered financial movements, large sums quietly transferred from my father's private accounts into new trusts under Andrew's name before he even passed. They'd been planning this for months, maybe even years. I realized with a sick twist in my stomach that my mother had been grooming this outcome long before my father died. She had worked hand in hand with Andrew to secure everything for him. She'd manipulated the family lawyer, pressured him to ignore the inconsistencies, and once my father was too weak to object, she made her final move. I was never meant to have anything. All those years of sacrifice, of believing I was doing the right thing for the family, it had all been part of their plan. When the full scope of their betrayal became clear, I stopped calling it grief. It was war now. I called my mother once. Just once. "I know what you did," I told her, my voice calm. There was a pause on the line before she answered. "You have no proof, Isabella. You should let this go. You'll only embarrass yourself." "That's where you're wrong," I said quietly. "And from now on, don't call me. Don't write to me. Don't expect anything from me ever again. You're dead to me." I hung up before she could respond. That was the last time I spoke to her. But Andrew kept pushing. He started posting about his wedding plans all over social media. Pictures of his fiancée in couture gowns, shots of the lavish venue he'd booked, an old cathedral-turned-ballroom that cost $500,000 just to reserve. He boasted about the menu, the live orchestra, and the guest list filled with high society names. And then one day, an envelope arrived at my apartment. It was a wedding invitation. From my mother. No personal note. No apology. Just an invitation with my name scribbled on it like I was an afterthought. They wanted me to watch. They wanted me to stand there quietly while Andrew flaunted everything he had stolen. I held that invitation in my hands for a long time. And then I smiled. Because that was the moment I decided when and where I would take everything back. I met with Maya the next day. We're not just going to court, I told her. We're going to expose them. Publicly. She arched a brow. How public are we talking? I leaned in. As public as it gets? I want the press. I want every guest at that wedding to know the truth before the night is over. So, we prepared. Maya pulled the original drafts of my father's will, hidden deep in the archives. She got an independent handwriting expert to confirm the forgery on the amendment. She subpoenaed the bank records showing the secret transfers. Piece by piece, the case was airtight. But I didn't want just legal justice. I wanted humiliation. So I reached out to a journalist who specialized in uncovering white-collar fraud in elite families. We agreed to release the story the morning after the wedding, timed perfectly for maximum impact. Then I went one step further. I arranged for the original will, the forged documents, and the financial evidence to be compiled into a single, undeniable presentation. And I made sure it would be delivered directly to the wedding venue. This wasn't about crashing the wedding. That would have been too easy, too predictable. No. I wanted them to stand there in their finest clothes, surrounded by their wealthy friends, basking in the glow of their stolen triumph, and then watch it all crumble in real time. I looked at Maya as we finalized the plan. They wanted me silent. I said, my voice low but steady. But I'm going to make sure the only thing anyone remembers from that wedding is what they did to me. She smiled, almost impressed. You're going to take them down on their biggest day. Exactly, I said. I'm not going to ruin the wedding. I'm going to take it back. Every last piece of what they stole will be mine again. And so I waited. Calm. Patient. While they spent weeks planning their perfect celebration, I spent weeks crafting their perfect downfall. The date was set. The guests were confirmed. The orchestra was booked. And so was my revenge. The day of Andrew's wedding dawned bright and clear, almost mocking in its perfection. The cathedral-turned ballroom glimmered with gold and white decorations. Guests arrived in sleek cars and designer gowns, clutching champagne flutes as they posed for photos in front of the massive floral archway. I arrived later than most, intentionally. And when I stepped out of the car, heads turned. I wore a floor-length gown of deep emerald silk, sharp and elegant, my hair swept into a simple but regal updo. Beside me walked Maya, her expression calm, purposeful. Trailing just behind were two others, my investigator and a journalist, both armed with cameras and files. I could feel the shift in the air as we entered. Whispers followed me like shadows. My mother's eyes widened just slightly when she saw me. She hadn't expected me to come. Andrew, standing at the altar in his perfectly tailored suit, smirked when he noticed me. His fiancée glanced at me curiously, clearly oblivious to the storm about to hit. The ceremony began smoothly. The music swelled. Guests hushed in reverence as the bride walked down the aisle, radiant in white lace. Andrew held her hand with that same smug expression he always wore, the one that said he believed he had won. And then the moment came. The MC's voice echoed through the grand hall. Before we begin the exchange of vows, he said, his tone shifting as the screen behind him flickered to life, there is a special message prepared for the groom and his family. Confused murmurs rippled through the crowd. Andrew's brow furrowed. My mother stiffened in her seat. And then the video played. It started with a clear image of my father's original will, my name boldly written as the primary beneficiary. The narration, calm and precise, explained how the original document had been filed months before his passing. Then came the handwriting analysis side by side, the authentic signature of my father, and the trembling, forged scrawl that my mother had submitted. Gasps filled the room. The video cut to the family lawyer, now speaking directly to the camera, his face pale. He confessed how my mother had pressured him, how Andrew had been present when the fake amendment was created, how they had moved funds before my father even died. His voice trembled as he said, I can no longer keep this secret. I was complicit, and I regret it. Next were the bank records, the timeline of suspicious transfers, emails between my mother and Andrew discussing how to handle Isabella. And finally, my father's note. His words and his voice were recorded long before he fell ill. Isabella will take care of everything. She has earned it. She will protect this family. The video ended with a single line on the screen. Justice delayed is not justice denied. The room was silent for a split second. Then chaos erupted. Guests gasped, turned to whisper furiously to one another. The bride's face crumpled in shock, her hand slipping from Andrew's arm. She stepped back, her eyes wide with disgust. "What is this?" she whispered. Andrew turned to the crowd, his face pale. "It's a lie. She's lying," he shouted, pointing at me. "This is all fake." But even as he shouted, two uniformed officers stepped into the room. Andrew Whitmore, one said firmly, "You're under investigation for inheritance fraud and financial misconduct. You'll need to come with us." "No. This is insane," he yelled, but his voice cracked panic seeping through. The bride fled down the aisle, tears streaking her makeup as her mother rushed after her. My mother stood frozen, her hand clutching her pearls. This can't be happening," she murmured. But when the second officer turned to her with a document in hand, informing her she was also under investigation for conspiracy and forgery, her composure shattered. The scene was utter bedlam. Guests were streaming out. Photographers snapped pictures. The journalist I had brought was already live blogging the scandal. I stood still in the middle of it all, calm, almost serene. Andrew looked at me one last time as the officers led him away. His eyes were wild, filled with rage and disbelief. "You'll regret this, Isabella," he spat. I didn't reply. I just watched him go. By the end of that day, the wedding was canceled. The cathedral emptied. The story was on every news site in the city. By morning, socialite wedding turns into scandal, inheritance fraud exposed. Within weeks, the courts validated the original will. My father's true intentions were honored. The company, the properties, the $12 million, they were all restored to me. Andrew faced criminal charges and was stripped of all his assets. My mother's reputation crumbled. Her social circle abandoned her as soon as the scandal hit the headlines. She moved out of the mansion, quietly choosing exile over shame. And me, I didn't go back to the mansion. I didn't want to live in a house that held so many ghosts. Instead, I took control of the company, restructured it, and renamed its charitable arm after my father. I started a foundation in his name, one that helped people instead of feeding empty prestige. I bought my place, a modest but beautiful home by the coast, far from the suffocating weight of my family's legacy. A few family members, distant cousins who had stayed neutral, reached out quietly to say they admired what I had done. And I found solace in the friends who stood by me, like Maya, who never let me fall apart. I didn't forgive my mother or Andrew. Forgiveness wasn't necessary. I simply let them fade into the past shadows of a life I had outgrown. For the first time in years, I felt free. I learned something important in all of this, something I wish I'd understood sooner. Blood doesn't guarantee loyalty. Family doesn't always mean love. And sometimes the only way to find justice is to take it for yourself. So I'll ask you, the one listening to my story now, if you were me, would you have forgiven them? Or would you have done exactly what I did, because in the end, justice isn't given, it's claimed.